Andrew Pearce.
And we're into the last hour, and the last hour, of course, tonight on Monday night, is Book Club. Delighted to tell you, with me in the studio is Matthew Collins, the author of Hate, My Life in the British Far Right, and Tony Thompson's here too. He's the author of Outlaws, Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs. Matthew, first to you, just tell me briefly what that book's about.
Well, it's about a 15-year-old boy in South London in the 1980s who feels a little bit isolated, and then suddenly along comes the British National Party and the National Front, and they fill his head up with all kinds of things, and spends 6 years inside the far right, but for 3 of them he'd changed sides for 3 of them. I was that young boy, obviously,
yeah,
and passed information to the anti-fascist organisation Searchlight.
Was there, I've read some of your book, there was a seminal moment for you, was there not, when you decided this was not what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I had a change of heart, or a change of direction. I began to question myself. An incident in Welling Library in 1989 when I went along with the BNP to exercise my democratic right to free speech, and we ended up hospitalising 17 people.
Some of them were old ladies?
Most of them old ladies, yeah.
In your book you say, down they went, trying to curl into defensive little balls, covering their tortured faces as we screamed, BNP, BNP, stamping in time, stamping on them, kicking their heads, stamping on their bodies, dragging them off the walls and into the middle of the room so that every one of our number could feed on them. The hammers were out and everything possible was smashed and destroyed. You were part of that.
Yeah, you read the good bit then.
Yeah. But
well, yeah.
You know what we
true.
journalists are like.
Yeah, well, it's, yeah, I mean, there's no point holding it back. For most of the book, I'm a proper little so-and-so. And then the redeeming bit is, I suppose, towards the end when I change my mind and come against them. But, yeah, I mean, that was one of a number of instances of violence over a 6-year period when, you know, the BNP was a tiny, tiny little party. The National Front were sort of a fading name. And the Combat 18 terrorist group was just sort of starting up. So I was right there in amongst it all, unfortunately.
We'll come back to that. Let's talk to Tony now. Just to remind you, Tony Thompson, he's the author of Outlaws, Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs. I thought you'd come in here in your leathers.
No, so I'd leave those outside for tonight. So.
What do you know about the violent world of biker gangs?
Well, I've managed to interview someone who's been very involved in that world for the last 25 years, and what the book is basically about is the events leading up to the murder of Jerry Tobin, who's the Hells Angel who was shot dead on the M40 motorway.
I remember.
4 years ago. It's about the formation of the Outlaws gang in the UK, who were sort of rivals of the Hells Angels, and about the battles between the two of them that led up to that particular moment and that particular murder.
What unites the biker gangs? What is it? What is their raison d'etre?
Well, it starts off, it's actually got similar to what Matthew said in some ways. It's about people feeling isolated, people looking for something to belong to, and some sort of cause to believe in. People who perhaps feel isolated from mainstream society, they tend to get drawn into these things and then become very passionate about them and are willing to do things that most people wouldn't do.
Is criminality a key part of their lives?
It's not an essential part of their lives, but there are plenty of people involved in these clubs who are deeply involved in criminality at an international level sometimes, because these clubs have representatives outside the UK, in America, in Europe, in Australia, and so on, and they're all linked and they all work together towards criminality if that's what they want to be involved in.
And how many biker gangs are there in Britain and in London, perhaps?
Yeah, no, we have all the major clubs here. We have 2 main ones in the UK, and that would be the Hells Angels and the Outlaws. They have several chapters in London and a few more across the country.
Pretty spooky world. Did you have a few hairy moments writing this book, researching this book?
Well, luckily, because I was writing about someone else's experiences, there were a few moments when I got to try to talk to some of my contacts and try to find out some information, but for the most part I was managed to stay fairly safe for a change.
Now, these gentlemen, they're both willing to take your calls. You can text them, email them, ask them questions about the world of bikers, outlaws, Hells Angels, and, of course, the far right. Maybe you're somebody who's voted for the BNP. I'm sure Matthew Collins here would like to put you right on that. Matthew, would you ever have thought back then in the 80s when you were smashing up libraries and joining in attacks on people who were borrowing books that the BNP would have members of the European Parliament and would in fact gain a considerable number of seats in Barking and Dagenham Council, albeit they've lost them? But did you really think they would make genuine electoral progress? And
No.
how did they do that?
Well, no, I didn't think that for a moment, but to be fair, they actually said that they were going to. They actually believed it. They did say that that's what they were going to do. How did it happen? Well, there's a number of reasons. I think my personal belief is that under New Labour, we sort of had the focus became less on class, less on community, and more about faith. And in some of the areas where the BNP did very well, that's sort of benign economic times, really. It wasn't. Lehman Brothers hadn't collapsed, and the BNP had 12 councillors on Barking and Dagenham Council. I think they saw an opportunity. I think once Labour sort of shifted away from sort of fully endorsing the trade unions and the class structures and class struggle, all that kind of thing, and I think the BNP quite easily filled a vacuum. The arguments no longer became about class; they became about race, they became about immigration, and I think a lot of people in the Labour movement were temporarily unfooted by how easily it was for the BNP to take very, very complex issues and give very, very simple answers, often lies, to these things. But the BNP thought they was going to actually take the whole council in 2010, and the organisation I work for, Hope Not Hate, we campaigned to remove them. One of the things that we found was it's about isolation. People feel isolated. People don't understand the effects of immigration. They have a fear about themselves, and slowly, we opened up a community. We got people talking to each other, knocking on doors. And slowly, the thing that really, really sticks with me is that so few people actually wanted the BNP. But it was such a strong protest that people, it galvanised people, the idea that they could cause outrage and draw attention to themselves. But deep down, they didn't really want the BNP there. They wanted to be listened to.
There was a sense, of course, that the BBC, Freudian slip, gentlemen, forgive me, the BNP tapped into was the sense that these foreigners, I use the word foreigners in quote marks, are taking our jobs and taking our council houses. That was the resentment, real or imagined, that they tapped into. Would you agree with that, Tony? Would you agree? Sorry, Matthew, forgive me.
Sorry, look at Tony. He was ready to answer that as well.
Yeah, well, I got it.
Maybe we'll go to it. Of course they did. Of course they did. And the issues, in Barking and Dagenham in particular, were that there were no council homes. In fact, there were no council homes for anybody to take, let alone the immigrants or asylum seekers. And the idea about jobs, well, it's not necessarily true. But again, it's a complex issue, isn't it? Immigrants create jobs. Immigration creates jobs. Immigrants will do jobs that other people won't want to do or just can't be bothered to do. And I think all of these things clashed at an appropriate time for the BNP because, not just the Labour Party who were in power at the time when the BNP was at its peak, but all the political parties either ran away from very difficult issues or they cashed in on it as well. I don't think the Conservative Party necessarily helped in the fight against the BNP. I don't think the Liberal Democrats did. And it was a whole thing about communicating, and the communication about was getting people to talk to each other. What are the issues? And the issues in Barking and Dagenham were that actually there was no council housing. And so then this great, what the BNP themselves say, the big lie begins, that all the council houses have gone to immigrants or have gone to asylum seekers. The reality was they just hadn't built any council houses, and those that were there previously were sold off.
The general election campaign was a disgrace because it was the elephant in the room. None of the political parties wanted to talk about immigration. Cameron's advisor said, don't talk about immigration because people will think you're the nasty party and you'd spend all this time trying to decontaminate the brand. Yeah, well, I think we've always said we'll have a debate about immigration. We're very comfortable in a debate about immigration, but we won't start from the position where we open up any debate by attacking immigrants or asylum seekers. An honest and open debate, we're very confident on that. But, the problem is, if you read the majority of newspapers in this country, day after day after day, there's horror stories about immigrants, horror stories about asylum seekers, and they are horror stories because very rarely do they actually tell the truth. We have and you work in the media, but we tend to have a bad news week every week in this country, normally focused around Muslims, asylum seekers, immigrants, and it tends to really take away from all the fantastic contributions they make. There are difficulties, there are problems, but we have we have very, very negative media with regards to those very issues. You're listening to Matthew Collins. He's the author of Hate, My Life in the British Far Right, which is published by Bite Back. Tony Thompson's here too. He's the author of Outlaws, Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs, published by Hodder and Stoughton. Before we go back to your book, Tony, you're a black man. What do you think of the BNP? How offended are you that some people still, not as in many numbers, thank God, support the BNP?
Well, I think it is offensive in some ways, but it is also understandable. I think what Matthew says about galvanising people was very true. I think also a lot of people in that part of London in particular were not being listened to. They were, no one was actually listening to their concerns. No one was actually doing anything about them. And the idea of being able to say something to someone and then see it on the news and realise that their concerns were being aired in a public forum was very powerful. It was incredibly powerful, and that's why they did so well.
Do call. These gentlemen are willing to take your calls if you want to talk about immigration in London and whether you have an issue about it, if you think it's too high. We're not going to take any calls from anybody racist, so don't even bother trying. We don't do that on LBC 97.3, but the number is 0845 6060 973. Text me 84850. Email me andrew@lbc.co.uk. You can tweet at LBC 973. I'd love to hear from a Hells Angel. I'd love to hear from a biker. Tell me all about it, why you're in a gang. I'd also love to hear from somebody maybe who used to support the BNP and, like Matthew Collins, has had a conversion, a Damascene conversion. He's not only not supporting them anymore, was dobbing them in. That's a good way of putting it, isn't it? Slang. But you were giving information on them to
Searchlight magazine.
The anti-fascist magazine.
The anti-fascist movement.
All right, so that's the number to call, 0845 6060 973. Time's now 9:15. It's not 10:15, honestly. Travel now with Alan Cowie. Hi, Alan.
Thank you.
We're in the book club, and to remind you, with me, Matthew Collins, who's the author of Hate, My Life in the British Far Right. He was a member of the BNP. He saw the light and was informing on them to Searchlight, the fascist magazine, the anti-fascist magazine, Freudian slip. His book is published by Biteback. He's here to take your calls, texts or emails. And Tony Thompson's here too, author of Outlaws, Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs. Now, violent world is an understatement, because your book tells me that there's such a code of conduct, or would you say a code of silence, that stabbings, shootings, even killings are routinely covered up by the bikers. The police never find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there've been one or two killings that the police haven't found out about, but certainly there is a huge amount of violence. There are, regular clashes between the gangs where people have been shot, people have been stabbed, and sometimes very badly wounded, and it's never reported to the police at all. That they know nothing about it, and this has been going on for many, many years now. And these clashes are horrific, and they are very much kept between the clubs themselves.
Now, is there a correlation between these disenfranchised young men who joined the BNP, perhaps in the 80s, when Matthew joined, and these men who joined these biker gangs? Because in the gang, there's some form of camaraderie, or honour amongst thieves, almost, if you like.
Yeah, no, I think there's always there's something to do with a sense of belonging, a sense of feeling, a camaraderie, a sort of sense of brotherhood, and the biker clubs are very much about that. They do talk about themselves as being this great brotherhood, about everyone backing everybody else up, and about everyone sort of believing in the same cause. So no, I think there are parallels there, without a doubt.
Now, tell me, a Midlands-based travel club went to Canada for firearms training to take on the Hells Angels. What's that about?
That was the early days of the Outlaws, when they were called the Midland Outlaws.
Right.
After one of their members was shot by the Hells Angels, they went over to Canada to learn how to use guns so they could come back over to the UK and take the war to the enemy, as they saw it.
Now, forgive me for being a little naive. Where do they get the guns from?
Oh, well, in Canada, obviously, they were much more easily available than they were over here, which is why they went there. They also went there because there were international club members who were willing to teach them how to use the weapons.
So did they bring the guns over from Canada, or they were then able to acquire guns when they were back here in Britain?
They were then able to acquire guns. What they did is basically just sort of beg, borrow and steal every weapon they could get, using shotguns, using weapons smuggled in from abroad, using reactivated weapons. I mean, it's the same way that any criminals have always managed to acquire weapons in the UK. You think about the fact that handguns are totally banned in the UK, and they have been for many, many years, and yet we still see them being used on a regular basis. For people who are in the know, who are in that underworld, who are connected to the underworld, acquiring weapons has never been difficult and never will be.
It all goes back to the fatal shooting of Jerry Tobin, shot on a motorway in broad daylight in Great Britain in 2007, shot dead on a motorway because he was a victim of gang warfare.
Yeah, the only reason he was targeted was because he was wearing a Hells Angels patch on his back, and the people who shot him were wearing Outlaws patches. They were, members of a rival gang, and these two gangs hate each other and have done since the mid-70s, when there was a clash in America between them. Ever since then, they've been at war, and there have been many, many clashes. In fact, another member of the Hells Angels was shot on the same motorway in 2001. He actually survived, but it was an almost identical situation. And actually, in America, another member of the Hells Angels was shot just a year before Jerry Tobin, again in identical circumstances, by members of the Outlaws as he rode down the motorway.
So you are potentially risking your life if you're spotted by a member of the rival gang if you're wearing the wrong sort of badge on your jacket or your crash helmet.
Well, one of the things that's happened over the last 25 years with the Hells Angels and the Outlaws is that whereas in the early days they would ride around quite freely on their own and just be sort of out for, to enjoy the sensation of being on a bike, nowadays they can't really go anywhere unless there's a group of them, unless they have security cars at the front and at the rear of their pack, because there is just so much danger of them actually being shot by members of the other gang.
Why don't the police sort this out?
Well, the police have been trying. I think for a long time the police really didn't know what was going on inside this world. It is so closed, and unless you're actually, involved, you really don't know a lot of what happens. They very much keep themselves to themselves. They don't speak to the police. They don't speak to anybody really about what's going on. So I think for a long time the police found it very difficult. And even now, although they have made some progress, and obviously they managed to successfully prosecute the killers with Jerry Tobin, there's still a lot that they don't realise that goes on.
Infiltration, I suppose, by if you like, a Matthew Collins figure, would be potentially lethal.
It would.
If you were caught.
It would be, yes. But one of the difficulties is that actually getting into one of these clubs takes an awful lot of time. You start off as what's called a probationary member, and it takes about 2 years to become a full patch member, to actually become a full member of the gang. So for a police force to try and infiltrate the gang, it would take them that amount of time with no guarantee that they'd actually find out.
But how do you become a member? You don't apply for it. There's not an application form in Motorbike Monthly. How do you get into these chapters?
You basically start off by just hanging around with them. You sort of find the places they go to, you find their pubs, and you get to know them. You drink with them, buy them drinks, get chatting to them. If they think you're the sort of person who would be able to bring something to the club to contribute to make it a better club, then they will invite you to become a probationary member.
So in the unlikely event, because I've only been on a motorbike once in my life, in the unlikely event that I decided I wanted to join the Hells Angels, what would they be looking for in me apart from long hair and a love of heavy rock?
Well, you'd have to really be into biking for one thing, obviously.
Well, that's the problem.
That would be a bit difficult. And yes, I mean, it's about the lifestyle. It's about wanting to dedicate your life to the club. I mean, it's not like joining any other kind of club. It's far more of a lifestyle choice. It's about sort of changing. Whatever you do when you're in the Angels or the Outlaws, the club has to come first. It comes before, family, before friends, before work. Sometimes, the club comes first, and it is your whole life, really.
Do women join?
Women can't actually join the club itself, but
so it's sexist as well as violent.
Yes, but women are integral to it. There's an awful lot of sex that goes on, an awful lot of surprise, and women are a huge part of it.
I think maybe we'll go and get a bike.
Now, Matthew Collins here is thinking you might get a motorbike. Matthew, before we go to the break, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
This is from Pete in Wimbledon. Does Matthew feel there was ever a link between the BNP and Sinn Féin?
No.
No?
No, I haven't choked in public lately, but no, absolutely not.
I'm not sure quite why Pete thinks that there might have been.
I should make a quick correction before all the loonies ring up. I mean, I joined the National Front and was chairman of South London National Front and a full-time employee. I never actually took out BNP membership because at that period you didn't need to.
Right.
But no, there was no connection between BNP and Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin is a radical leftist sort of organisation. The BNP is a fascist organisation.
Which is in terminal decline, you hope, I heard.
Oh, absolutely in terminal decline. I mean, tonight I imagine they're burning all their financial records.
The mind boggles. Why so?
Well, I imagine they've got so many of their members asking questions where the money's gone.
Right.
That anyone with half a brain in the BNP will be destroying whatever they got. It's not. A few years ago at Searchlight, the BNP's shredded accounts turned up on our doorstep.
What is it about people who go to the European Parliament and spending other people's money. Because
I don't blame them for that. I mean, I do that as well.
Yeah.
on my Harley Davidson with my biker gang.
Right. Now, after the break, of course, I will be talking to Matthew Collins about the far right and the English Defence League because, of course, the publication of his book, published by Bite Back, couldn't be more timely after the shocking events in Norway. There's been another memorial service today. I'll be talking to Tony Thompson about the extraordinary, violent world of biker gangs. You think it's just on TV and in the... It's a real scary world out there. And if you are a Hells Angel, do call. Would love to hear from you. And if you are perhaps a former member of the BNP or the far right, would like to hear from you too. And generally, if you've got questions for these guys, they're happy to take them. They're not shy, you know. They're not shy retiring violets, either of them. Number is 0845 6060 973. Text 84850. Email andrew@lbc.co.uk.
Standing in for Ian Dale, Andrew Pearce.
Now, just to remind you, next week LBC 97.3 is giving you the chance to meet and put your question to Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. Ian Dale will host the hour-long show next Monday evening, that's August the 8th, at a central London location from 6 o'clock. So for your chance to ask a question and to be in the audience, register now at lbc.co.uk. And coming up at 10, of course, the wonderful Anthony Davis will be asking whether you think Sunday parking charges are reasonable after Westminster City Council tonight is due to decide whether to implement parking proposals which will see motorists having to pay to park when it had been previously been free. Also, Boris Johnson, the London Mayor, is to consult Chancellor George Osborne on a new proposal to build the world's largest airport in the Thames estuary. Is London ready for a new airport? And parts of Britain enjoyed sunshine and scorching heat today as temperatures were higher than in Sydney and Rio. But how much attention do you pay to weather reports before you venture outdoors? And did you put your sunblock on? I hope so. All that and more with Anthony Davis from 10. Now, to remind you, in the studio, in Book Club, Matthew Collins is here. He's written a great book called Hate, My Life in the British Far Right. It's published by Bite Back, and it's available for a price of $14.99. Tony Thompson's here too. He's the author of Outlaws, Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs, published by Hodder and Stoughton, $12.99. Bargains each. Right, question for you both. Let's go to Matthew first. I wondered if the image of a National Socialist in 2011 is still the skinhead, skin girl. That's from Rona.
No, it's not. No, absolutely. They do exist. The people prefer not to call them skinheads. The Nazi ones are called boneheads because they are legitimate skinheads. No, not really. Those people now have fallen by the wayside. The proper Nazi now will wear a suit, will wear a shirt, will wear a tie, and will no longer mention the Holocaust and deporting people, send people to different countries. They'll talk about immigration, they'll talk about asylum, they'll talk about the rise of Islam, they'll talk about very similar things that you pick up in most national newspapers. Under that suit, of course, are all those old tattoos. I remember the BNP once issued instructions to its members that if you're going out canvassing and you have a skinhead, either wear a wig or a baseball cap. But it's all about image. I mean, they've caught up with the modern imagery, haven't they? It's about looking good. It's not so much about what your politics are about, if it looks good and looks realistic.
And, of course, for a while, Matthew, Nick Griffin, the leader of the BNP, Cambridge educated, seemed a plausible, to some, leader.
To some, but let's put it into perspective. There's thousands and thousands of council seats in this country. The BNP actually held 60. They had one who's now obviously no longer a member. They had one GLA member here in the London Assembly, and they have 2 Euro MPs. So, you know, they're not as big as the Green Party. They're less represented, I believe, than UKIP in Europe. But it's worrying because what the BNP represent more than any other small party it is, of course, hatred. It is an absolute hatred. It's a division of all people based solely on their colour. So one BNP councillor was too many. They got their first one in 1993, which is a year I
was there when he won.
Well,
I was covering it for my paper. I was on the Times, and he was as thick as 2 short planks.
Yeah, well...
He could barely string a sentence together.
Well, we're talking about Derek Beacon.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, in the run-up to that campaign, it was on the Isle of Dogs when the BNP won its seat. You know, the BNP's national organiser was jailed along the way for smashing the glass into the face of a black man who was walking along the street with a white woman. Now, I will be fair. I will be fair to them, as fair as I can be, knowing what they're really like. The BNP in 2000 and 2006 and 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 is remarkably different to the BNP that I was involved in. Because the BNP I was involved in and went out volunteering in the streets with and volunteered in the bookshop, at least had the decency to admit they were Nazis.
Yeah, and now you think they're trying to pretend they're something they're
Well,
not.
we all know that they pretend to be something else. And that's one of the reasons why we don't necessarily think it's right to attack BNP voters or even some BNP members. One of the things that really comes across with us is how little about the BNP members actually know. The party's got this hardcore of, I think it's like 150 or 200 people who are the only ones that get to vote. They're the ideological core. The rest of the people, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, not dissimilar to ordinary working class, white working class voters, don't actually know what lies in the centre of the BNP. And if you look at the leadership of the BNP now, all of them are former National Front leaders. Because that's the ideological core that they run their party on. And they can tell lies and they can smear people. But, I mean, we're looking, I think we were talking about it during the break, that the BNP looks like it's finished. It really does look like it's finished. But it doesn't mean that necessarily some of those gripes, some of those difficulties, some of those misunderstandings and isolations go away. You don't defeat racism, you don't defeat fascism just by defeating the party. The work that has to be done in communities has to continue. And I work for Hope Not Hate, the organisation, and that's what we're doing. The BNP don't just come out at elections. Neither does racism and fascism rear its head just at elections. And so 365 days a year, we're out in communities working against it because we realise it's never gone away. Mosley, and then we had Tyndall, the big National Front in the 70s, and the National Front and the BNP in the 80s and 90s, and now the BNP, although it's diminishing. People far too quickly thought these parties are now destroyed, or now they can no longer get their 5% in the elections. We've somehow defeated their message. But of course, we don't believe we have. We have a long way to go, because they keep coming back.
That's Matthew Collins. He speaks with authority about the BNP because he was part of the BNP, and then he saw the light. I know it's a cliche, and turned against them and informed on them as best he could. Now, a question for Tony. Tony, to remind you, is the author of Outlaws Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs. This is from Rona. Is there a code of honour with bikers, she asks?
Well, yes. I mean, they have several sort of codes. They have several rules and regulations that they all abide by. One of those is that they wouldn't speak to the police. They wouldn't make any statements to the police. There have actually been situations where people have been charged with murder and have gone to prison and served part of their sentences because they simply wouldn't make a statement to the police saying that they weren't involved. So no, there's a very strong code of honour, a very strong code of ethics among the bikers themselves.
Now, you found somebody, of course, for your book. He was a member of Outlaws MC. Now, he broke that code of silence because he talked to you at length. You've changed his identity, I assume, in the book to protect him. But he was able to lift the lid a lot for you on what was going on. If he was found, if they caught him, what would happen to him?
Well, both the Outlaws and the Hells Angels have sayings of what they do to people who break the code of silence. For the Hells Angels, they say 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. And for the Outlaws, they say snitches are a dying breed. So that kind of gives you an idea of the kind of things that these clubs will get involved in. So I have gone to great lengths to keep his identity secret, and will continue to do so.
How did you find him? I know you're a journalist. You don't want to give away your contacts, but did he know you were doing this book and approached you because he wanted to get this out?
No, he approached me shortly after the death of Jerry Tobin. That was something that affected him quite deeply.
Did he know Jerry Tobin?
He didn't know, but he knew the people who were involved in doing the shooting.
Right.
So he was being asked by his friends how it was that something he'd been involved in for such a long time could end with the cold-blooded murder of a complete stranger. And he felt that the only way to explain that was to approach someone like myself and explain what had been going on for the previous 25 years and how it had led to that particular point. By
withdrawing from his group, what were they called, Outlaws MC, don't those outlaws think it must be him? He's not part of us anymore.
Well, no, I mean, he left a couple of years ago, and obviously people sort of join and leave all the time. So, and there are, a huge number of people in this club and have been over the years. And he's not, although he's the main source for the information in the book, he's not the only source. I mean, there are other people that I've spoken to. So, I mean, yeah, some of the information came from him directly. Some of it is also backed up by other people. So,
How many outlaws stroke Hells Angels are there in Britain, do you think? And where are they concentrated?
They're mostly in the Midlands, although there is quite a strong contingent in London as well. But the Midlands is sort of the heartland for the outlaws themselves. For the Hells Angels, it tends to be London and the South East. They're a bit stronger there. But overall, you're probably talking about not a huge number of people, probably about 1,000 people overall for those two clubs in the UK. Then there are lots of other smaller clubs that are allied to one or the other, or that are associated. But even though it's a relatively small number, it's hugely influential.
After the killing of Tobin, did you get any sense that the police were determined, actually now we've got to do something about this?
Oh, very much. I mean, there were a huge number of raids. They spent a huge amount of money investigating bikers on both sides, both the Hells Angels and the Outlaws, and trying to get more information about what was going on. And I think, as I say, they did make some progress. Part of that was down to the fact that the murder itself was pretty shoddily carried out and very sort of amateurishly covered up, so they didn't have a lot of difficulty in actually finding out what happened.
But potentially it could have been a disaster, because this man was speeding up a motorway and he's shot and his bike goes flying. It could have caused a major pile-up.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, there was very little regard to that from the people who were actually involved. No, it was lucky that it ended only with one death, if you can look at it that way.
Are they very clever, the men who join this organisation? I mean, what sort of day jobs do they have?
Well, some of them are. I mean, some of them are, doing very sort of low-skill jobs. But there are people there who are bankers, who are accountants, who are
bankers again.
In fact, actually, recently there was a Conservative councillor who was found to be a member of the Outlaws.
What?
So they come from all walks of life.
Has he been suspended from the Conservative Party?
I don't believe he has at the moment. No.
Well, do we need to name and shame him, don't we, at some point? Where is he? Which part of the world is he in?
Oh, it's on the tip of my tongue, and I will remember it, but it will come back to me. But he's not in London.
But I suppose it's not illegal to be a member of the Hells Angels. It's not illegal to be a member of the Outlaws. It's just illegal if you choose to break the law.
That's right, although it is illegal in some countries, and they're looking in Australia at making it an offence there. But at the moment in the UK, no, it's not illegal. And and there are a lot of members of these clubs who do nothing, who don't break the law, who are just there for the brotherhood, who are just there because they enjoy riding their motorcycle.
Do you think there should be moves to make them illegal?
Well, no, I think that would be overly oppressive, and I think what you have within these clubs are a sort of inner circle of members who may be involved in criminality. But I go to great pains to avoid saying that everyone who's involved in these clubs is a criminal, because that just wouldn't be true.
And Hells Angels escorted out of the Republic of Ireland by armed paramilitaries? Yeah,
that happened in the early 90s. The Hells Angels were trying to establish themselves in Ireland and got involved in a huge fight with a bunch of other clubs, who then formed an alliance to prevent them from setting up there. And after a particular brawl in Kilmeaden, the Angels were escorted out of the country by the local paramilitaries at gunpoint.
Yeah, well, there'd be quite a few paramilitaries in Ireland in those days, of course. That was before the historic agreement.
Still is now.
Yes, I know, there's quite a lot of guns. Probably the wrong place to try and set up in opposition to the paramilitaries, wouldn't you think?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I'm talking to Matthew Collins. He's written a book called Hate, My Life in the British Far Right. I'm going to talk to him about, is the English Defence League the new bogeyman now here in Britain, after its links were exposed to that lunatic who went on the rampage in Norway? And Tony Thompson, he's written a book called Outlaws, Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs. Hate, My Life in the British Far Right, published by Biteback, $14.99, cheap at the price. Tony Thompson's book, Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs, Outlaws Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs, Hodder and Stoughton, $12.99, cheap at the price. So do text them, email them, call them, any questions, any observations. And where are you lot who may have supported the BNP? We'd love to hear from you. Don't be too ashamed, because we'll be very gentle with you, very kind to you, very nice to you. We'd like a proper conversation. 0845 60 60 973. That's the number. Time is now 9:45. And we'll get the latest update on all the problems on the train tonight with Alan Cowie. Hi, Alan.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening.
So, breaking news, a number of new parking measures are now set to be introduced in central London after being approved by Westminster Council's Cabinet tonight. The council has voted to extend the hours of control, that's how they put it, not us, from Monday to Saturday until midnight and between 1 o'clock and 6 o'clock on Sundays. That's 1300 hours and 1800 hours on Sundays. Anthony Davis will be speaking with a representative of Westminster Council shortly after 10 p.m. this evening, so stay tuned to LBC 97.3 for more, and I know you will have plenty to say on that issue, but do keep your powder dry until Anthony Davis takes over from me at 10. We're still in the book club, we're in the last quarter, so this is your last chance to speak to these guys. Matthew Collins, to remind you, Hate My Life in the British Far Right, published by Bitesback. Tony Thompson, Outlaws Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs, and they make my skin crawl, those guys. Hodder and Stoughton. We can't have this conversation, Matthew Collins, without referring to the extraordinary and shocking events in Norway.
Yep.
I don't know if he was a loner, he was nuts, that's for sure, but we do now know there was extensive communication between him and members of the English Defence League,
Yep.
another, would you call them fascist organisation?
Well, yeah, I think I would. I think I would
Right.
call them a fascist organisation. One of my major gripes is that this government would say that they're neither, or has said, that they're neither far right or extremist. Believe it or not, they're not a far right or extremist organisation.
Their website, if you go on their website, it just says close down all mosques.
Yeah, well, there you go. Maybe you could ask the government to have a look at it. In all seriousness, we've been campaigning. We said, look, if we're not going to ban this organisation, because, you know, it's a difficult thing to ask for a ban, but why aren't the English Defence League treated like so many other extremist organisations in this country? Why aren't the police they're spending as much time monitoring the EDL, and there's evidence of their members photographing themselves with guns, there's members of the EDL being raided for guns, there's members of the EDL up before the courts almost every day of the week for violence directed at members mainly in the Muslim community, but not exclusively in the Muslim community. Why aren't the police monitoring and treating this organisation the same way they treat, you know, the flip side of the coin, some of these radical Islamist groups?
Mm.
You know, we believe extremism breeds extremism,
Yeah.
plague on both your houses. But certainly the EDL are not treated as an extremist organisation. And up and down this country, week in, week out, we see hundreds of their members drunk, causing trouble, involved in violence and attacks. And because their leader goes on television and says we're not a violent organisation, in fact, he went on Newsnight the day he'd been convicted in court of football hooliganism to say he wasn't the leader of a violent organisation.
Why? What is it about these extremists in football?
I think it's another part of the English disease, isn't it? We seem to export so many of the worst aspects of this country, and I think the flip side is we don't actually talk about some of the great aspects of this country. We spoke about immigration. Look at our fantastic multicultural society that we have. We don't seem to talk up the good things about this country, and I think there's a bit of a class issue too. I think coming back to what I said earlier, I think people in the EDL for some reason believe that they're defending Christian values. What they know about Christianity, I've got no idea. Probably the same as Adrian Trowdy knows about Islam. Not a lot. And I think there's a confusion, and I think there's a difficult arguments to be had. We've got no objections to, if people in this country want to ask difficult questions about Islam or Christianity or Judaism, they can ask them. The representatives of Judaism, Christianity and Islam in this country would quite happily answer the questions. The EDL isn't asking questions. It is attacking people solely on the basis of their religion.
Do you hope that one positive benefit to come out of the terrible events in Oslo, Norway, that it will shame people who'd otherwise thought maybe they could be, at least have a look at organisations like the EDL, that it could be the death of organisations like the English Defence League?
I do sincerely hope it does, and I think if you look at some of the very early Fleet Street headlines when the news broke about what happened in Oslo, automatically, without any seeming investigation, people just assumed it was an Al-Qaeda attack.
Yes,
I hope
that's right.
people in this country realise there are two flip sides to this extremism. They both feed on each other, and they both started off as very, very small groups, and now they've exploded. And you know, in terms of their size, their numbers, the newspapers tend to overstate their influence. We see Tommy Robinson on TV more often than not. He's even charging £50 an interview to some journalists. Could the flip side not be, perhaps, that next time from the Muslim community, we go to one of those millions of Muslims in this country who want peace and aren't extremists, instead of continually putting up an extremist radical Muslim, so that we get an actually balanced view of what's going on in this country? Because the EDL represents, you know, as me, I'm a white working class bloke who's a patriotic Englishman, and I see these morons waving my national flag and wearing my country's football shirt, and they don't know anything about this country.
Before I go back to Tony Thompson, question here from Eric in Finsbury Park for you, and it says this: what made Matthew do a 180-degree turn?
Well, a number of things. I think the excessive violence. I think growing up, you have to remember it was between 15 and 21 years of age I was involved. I grew up, and let me tell you, if you spend, when you're growing up, you ask a lot of very difficult questions, and I think the problem is no one wanted to answer those questions. And I was involved in the BNP and the National Front and C18 when they had numbers like 150, 200 nationally, 300 at the most. And now look at the BNP. It's 3,000-4,000 strong. So I just I did a flip turn because I had to go and work these things out for myself, and I was sickened by the violence. I was sickened by being a working class person in an organisation whose leaders had never done a day's work in their life. So I just woke up and discovered actually I'm white, working class, and I've got far more in common with black and Asian working class than I've got in common with these idiots.
Very interesting answer, and very frank answer too. Tony, when you began your book on Hell's Angels, did you have any perception of just how violent a world you were entering?
No, I mean, I think I'd written about bikers a few times before over the years, but I think the information I got for this book just really shocked me. It really made me realise I knew very little. I didn't realise the scope of it, the level of violence, the level of sophistication, and just how big and how deep and how international these organisations are.
For you, Tony, Richard in Greenwich says, re gangs, nothing compares to the mongrel mob in New Zealand. Do you know what he's talking about?
Yeah, they're pretty hardcore. But I would actually say that a lot of what goes on in the UK and elsewhere is actually just as shocking as what goes on in New Zealand.
Which would be the capital now of these biker gangs? Is it the United Kingdom or is it the United States?
Well, actually, interestingly, there are now, I mean, it all started in the United States after the Second World War, but actually, interestingly now, there are now more biker clubs in the UK and in Europe than there are in America. It's actually expanding much faster in Europe and in the UK than anywhere else. In fact, the head of the Outlaws was recently the European and Asian head of the whole organisation. He was based in the UK, just because, we now have so much influence and power, and there are so many members of these gangs in this country that it's become quite a power base for them.
Are they mainly white men?
Yeah, almost exclusively.
Why is that?
It's just the
similar thing about the BNP.
Yeah, partly. Yeah, I mean, I think the Hells Angels have a rule that they basically don't allow black people to join. The Outlaws have a few.
So they're racist as well as.
Yeah, I think the Hells Angels would describe it by saying that no black people have actually applied, as far as they're concerned, or at least have never actually got through the membership process anyway. But the Outlaws do have a few mixed race members, but for the most part, no, it attracts a certain sort of. I mean, they have a certain level of purity that they're trying to maintain within the organisation.
Do they ban gay people too?
Yes, I think they would do, but there are a few in there, obviously. So.
Are there?
Oh, yeah.
It's the leather, maybe.
Yes.
We've only got 2 minutes left, gentlemen, so I'm just going to ask you to, 30 seconds, paraphrase your book for me, Matthew Collins.
Okay, it's called Hate, My Life in the British Far Right by Matthew Collins. It's a rather sexy, bawdy, violent, boots and all tale about growing up in Thatcher's Britain. It's actually an excellent read. It will shock you. It will convince you that we need to actually take a far greater stand against the far right in this country. And it's got a nice ending. It'll turn out lovely. Well,
you turned out to be a great talker too, I must say. Before I go to Tony to summarise his book, Matthew, if Nick Griffin saw you in the street, what would he say to you?
I have no idea.
What would you say to him?
I'd say, get off the pavement.
Good answer.
Thank you very much.
Good answer. Tony Thompson. This is your life.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. A book's about it's about 25 years of bikers in the UK. It's about how people starting off in a small club with a love of biking ended up being drawn into this massive international global conspiracy, ended up committing cold-blooded murder just because they were from one club and someone else was from another club.
And as you say, you got to somebody who'd been part of that world for a very long time.
Yeah, someone who actually was willing to lift the lid and explain how these things go on and why it is that they make the decisions that they do, why they join, why they end up killing each other.
So just to remind you that these guys are Matthew Collins. He wrote Hate, My Life in the British Far Right, published by Biteback. It's available from...
Is it Friday?
From Friday. £14.99. Tony Thompson. Outlaws Inside the Violent World of Biker Gangs, published by Hodder and Stoughton, or Staunton, how do you pronounce it?
Stoughton.
Stoughton, I thought so. £12.99, published on
Thursday.
So these books are available this week. Get them on Amazon. Go on the internet. You can find them. I'm Andrew Pearce. I've been standing in for Ian Dale. Anthony Davis is coming up next, and I'm sure you've got a lot to say about Westminster Council and the parking charges. I'll be back with you tomorrow at 7. Anthony Davis is coming up next. You're listening to LBC 97.3.